buongiorno a tutti. Grazie Giorgio, Nimo, a tutti di Nimo. Per un momento è un grande onore per me essere qui, Passi, here, e avere l'opportunità di condividere alcune riflessioni per Thanatology globale. Ma prima di iniziare, non parlo italiano. This is only to say thank you, and I really wanted to take a second to say this in Italian, but I will be speaking in English, I'm afraid. But I will say this. But yeah, but I will say this that and I made a couple notes that I wanted to say this in Italian. So oggi esploreremo. You can put the slides up as well. Esploreremo uno sguardo comparativo e globale sulle diverse concezioni culturali della morte, del lutto e dell'aldilà. Andando oltre i modelli occidentali che spesso dominano il discorso accademico, ma anche il pratico professionale. Correct?
Sì.
Good, perfect. So this was just I just tried to put it in a simple sentence, really what it is that we wanted to do today. Just I wanted to make sure that everybody would then follow that with me. So so very briefly, and before I really dive into this slide deck, I wanted to share. So I've been doing thanatology for about between 18 and 20 years, and in fact, I started doing thanatology as a volunteer SOS Dad in Uganda when I was quite in my late teens, and I was working with dying children. And I found that it was quite significant, the work that was done there was so significant in terms of the quality of life. So la qualità di vita. The quality of life for children, especially when they didn't have any parents or any family members around them. And I think that I carried that with me over the years, and I think it invited me into this space of working, not necessarily on death, because for me it's not death or grief. It's really about quality of life and the dignity for people to live a life that's fulfilling and rewarding and respected until the end. The end and death is just the fact, and it will happen. So for me, that's the drive. So when I talk about thanatology, really life. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to work with various individuals from across the world, particularly in disasters as well. So where there's been tsunamis or earthquakes, and people have had multiple losses that they've experienced. And I think what I want to share with you today when I talk about global thanatology is a bit of that experience and the knowledge I've acquired from working with all these individuals in terms of both the understanding that we have across different cultures around death and grief, but also how that then impacts the way we experience it in life and how that then advances the quality of life as well. So mostly these are reflections from the knowledge I've acquired over those years. So that's what I'm going to do today. And do you want me to be? Oh, okay. Perfect. I will try to go through a few things here that you see on the slide, but I won't necessarily stay on all the slides that you'll see on the screen. Pardon. But I've included information on the slides so that we can quickly flick through them just as a reference for what it is that we're talking about, because we want to have that contrast between the linear approaches to thanatology and the cyclical approaches to thanatology when it comes to appreciating or understanding the experiences of death and grief. And maybe a good starting point is to be thinking about a map of the different categorizations of thanatologies, perhaps. And we do have these three that we see on the screen. And first of all, So if we want to have a brief map of the different thanatologies, this would be it. So there's three clusters, and we have the Western thanatology, and
Quello
comes
occidentale.
with all those grief stages and the technicalities and the biomedical models quite often that help measure success in grief support, or, what can we count there? They come with that underpinning cultural understanding of finality more generally, that the death is the end, rather than that having any continuity, albeit it does recognize the continuity of a relationship, perhaps, that there's been. And then we also have the more global and indigenous methodologies as well. And there we find a lot of different teachings and a lot of different beliefs that come in to talk more about that circular nature of life and the concepts of rebirth and the concepts of karma and concepts that come under sutras and the different teachings that are very unfamiliar to the Western world, perhaps. So there's a divide there. And the different concepts of cosmology as well. So the ancestries, and when we think about the indigenous populations and the beliefs of us returning to the earth and where we come from and where we belong. And then there are also the more contemporary thanatologies where you have, the more fancy stuff, the latest trends like the green burials and the use of ashes to create different commodities. We have new disciplines being introduced, like the death doulas and the end-of-life doulas, which were not there before. So, but there are contemporary aspects of thanatology in every nation in some way or another, for certain. And perhaps the one that is quite common across the globe with contemporary thanatologists would be the digital afterlife, sort of, how legislation, then how Google and all these media platforms, as well as, your emails and everything, there's now more and more legislation since the last 5 years about what happens to that data. But the truth is that, we still pay large companies a lot of compensation with our data. We just don't know it. And how do all these different cultural approach, or different cultures and traditions approach death and dying? And this is not anything new, but just thinking about the Western thanatology and the more indigenous and global thanatologies. How do those differ? So first of all, how they're viewing death either as a natural transition or perhaps a medical event. So for example, in the UK, the government pays a lot of money to train doctors to be able to diagnose death, to be able to diagnose when somebody has actually died. And to start preventing incidents that we found that, that there have been people buried alive, for instance, and then, you find out later, and you find out that they've been buried for 2 weeks before they actually died. There's different attitudes. It affects and it influences the decision-making process, especially in end-of-life care. And I think in the talks we heard yesterday and the day before, some of you were talking about those concepts as well. The idea of pain management, that in the more Western thanatologies, pain management is a focus. But, we got to wonder, why has that brilliant hospice movement that actually started in the 19th century in France, not necessarily in England, but it was popularized in the mid-20th century by James Cicely Saunders in the UK and then spread across. Why has it been so popular in the Western world and not the rest of the world? So it's quite important to be asking those questions, because essentially it maybe hasn't gone across the globe because it's not needed across the globe. There's a different way of doing it. And some of those ways are, the community-orientated approaches, which perhaps we don't do a lot or enough when you move across. So I think Salvatore was presenting the rituals in Uganda. I happen to have spent part of my childhood in Uganda, and I have been there and I know what he was talking about. And it's very different. The community is there in a very different way than we think we have community here. So that's the hospice work. It doesn't need an institution for it to happen. And so there's two ways to think about thanatology. That's what I'm kind of putting together from these years, is that we have the cyclical thanatology, which essentially does not see death as something final, but it sees death as the vehicle to something else, and there's continuity, and there is a cycle that goes with it. Um, and so death is a natural event that is welcomed and embraced, and people will dance at the funeral, right? And then you have the linear thanatology, which is a little bit more strict in the way that it follows a particular path. So it talks about, you live one life, you have one death, and there's a progressiveness to time and how we understand time, and there's finality to it. So death is the end. And we often culturally in these parts of the world will talk about life or death, it's a life or death situation. But it's not, the opposite of death is birth. Really, it's not life. Life is a continuum. So cyclical and linear then. Yeah, I think that because procedurally, technology and advancements in medicine, change that. Because death 200 years ago was much better celebrated. Now it's become a medical event. That's the common consensus, I guess. And these distinctions between the cyclical and the linear do matter because they help us understand how people interpret death, how they interpret their grief. They help us understand how they cope with it. What is it that works for them? What are the rituals that become the medium for those helping situations? What are the different systems of morality and ethicality that are also important to them? And what are their particular attitudes towards aging as well? Because naturally we take death and we think of death only for older people. Of course, people die at any age. There's no discrimination around that. But statistically, yes, older people die more than the younger in this part of the world. When you move to other parts, it will be very different. So it's quite important to look at those distinctions. But let's look at a couple of characteristics of the linear models of death. And I actually think there's a very quick and easy way to say it, which is that it sees progress of life in three steps. So birth, life, death. That's the linear model, right? So you're born, you live, you die. That's it. And so we administer that process in the meantime, as we live, the hospitals do and the communities do. And it provides that sense of finality, and there's an emphasis on closure. We talk a lot about closure. We talk a lot about what is our legacy. So we want to have more children as well, because that's one of the methods to leave legacy behind. We want to, do a lot of things about how can we be remembered. And there is that sensibility, the sense of irreversibility of death in the linear model as well. And of course, all that ties in with religion quite a lot. And if we think of the Abrahamic traditions and finality, you've got Judaism, you've got Christianity, and you've got Islam, the three main Abrahamic religions, all of which have massive similarities around what that linearity of life and death is. So all of them have the same foundations, same teachings in different words and in different contexts. And you've got Christianity that will focus more on that idea of judgment, right? The binary of good and bad, and as well as death being a threshold for being finished. There's nothing more, and what's left and what goes to heaven or hell is something that belongs to the deity now. Whereas the teachings as well for Islam that talk more about the journey towards that eternal destination, that again, your soul or after death belongs to that set of deities as well. So with a similar kind of like idea for the afterlife. So essentially those Abrahamic traditions teach that progression from life to death and then the afterlife. And the afterlife, a religious concept for it. And of course, in the linear models, we have those biomedical approaches to end-of-life care, where essentially we focus more on what is the biological cessation of all kind of like of the body. How does it shut down? So we're dead. And the focus is that, and hence why, you know, why do we in the Western world only in the last 20 years focus so much on, oh, there's cultures, there's, you know, different traditions, we have to be sent, were we not before? What is this revelation in Germany and in the UK and in Spain and in Italy that just now, oh, there's cultural differences? Of course, they've always been. Populations and humanity has moved around for ages. It's nothing new. And of course, for the next 10 slides, we're going to go fast because I'm not going to talk to those slides much, but it's for reference for saying, you know, what are the key contributors and the underpinning foundations, I guess, of those linear thanatologies that we talk about. You know, you've got those grief stages, and I think every person I've come across who works in grief has generated their own stages. Apologies for saying this to those that support them, but to me, they're absolutely all the same. There's no difference. There's a difference about how they were generated and what data they were deriving from, those that come from data, because there are many that are very theoretical as well. So, for example, you know, that popularity for Kübler-Ross's work, you know, we've taken it and we massively kind of popularized it as the grief stages that you know, applies to everybody. It comes from dying people. So it's the stages that people go through in the grief when they are dying. It's not the grievers. And there are people with terminal illnesses being hospitalized for more than 2, 3 months that have engaged in that work. So those stages in the work, you know, what it gives us is from a dying older person in a hospital bed without family. So they're very specific, but we, you know, this we take them as the gospel, I guess. I just want to say, you know, so the key contributors, and we can start from Freud and the work that he did in melancholia. But again, you know, Freud's work comes from him having, you know, one of his sons who died in the war, and then he lost his daughter, and he's locked up in a basement writing a. He didn't go somewhere in the field to learn about it. So it was his feelings. He put it on paper, but yet that's our gospel. And we assess grief in life based on that, which is not necessarily wrong, but we have to recognize it for what it is and whether it works for us or not. Similarly, with John Bowlby's work, and everybody across the world would know this is the attachment theory, but that's not its name, actually. The theory is called the theory of emotions. That's the actual theory. And the goal for the theory was not to do with attachments, the work. It was to do with loss and grief. So another 4 stages from Bowlby's work as well. But of course, that was based on, and we can skip the Kübler-Ross one, that was based on the primary caregivers, sort of, which was at the time primarily white women of middle upper class that were not employed. That was it. So let's be quite, you know, sensitive to the fact of, you know, what it is that it's teaching us. Worden's work as well, which thankfully, after years and years, considered culture and religion to it as well, because it didn't for a very long time. But again, you know, talking about the seasons, you've got Charles Core's work as well, another few stages and steps. You've got Colin Parks as well, another few steps and stages, all the same, in my view, all significant for what they did. None of this comes from knowledge of how do people with severe mental disabilities experience grief. How is grief experienced by people with dementia? How is grief experienced by the carers for other people? None of these steps and stages have been looked at in that respect. And of course, you've got the bonds, and you know, we talk a lot about that. You've got the DPM, the dual process model. You've got, I'll stop for you in just a second. Let's finish those slides. And then you've got the Ralph and others work again about the oscillation, which is very similar to the DPM. And then, of course, terror management theory that talks a lot about how when we talk about death, we start becoming more resilient to it. But there are critiques And we have to think of alternatives to some of these things because many of these things work in one context, but not necessarily across the globe. And the first bit is that overemphasis of linear thanatologies on closure. And that starts ignoring the bonds that continue. Yes. Do you want to interrupt me? No. um, on closure. And I remember so my work, I started as a psychotherapist to begin with, and I've got a mixed background. So I've gone from practice into research, into academia, and then policy making. So I do remember one of my first jobs on to do with death. I mean, all of my jobs had to do with death, but was in the military. And when I was in the army, quite young, I was doing grief support for families when a soldier had died. And it was a very fascinating context and very unique one as well. You know, you don't do much around that. And I do remember this point where I didn't really know much, but someone from higher up in the hierarchy showed up at the hospital where we're to this mother and father, this couple, that their son is dead. And this person came on and he said, I got this. And he went out to this mother who was on the floor crying and said, well, this now happened. You just need to move on. And I found it extremely shocking. I found it very, I should not have been shocked, actually, now that I think about it. So in the context of the army, I do. Actually. But when I heard that, and it stayed with me for many years, I was like, this is not. So why does somebody, first of all, but why does somebody need to move on? So when you are a mother whose child died, give you an example, that was your lonely child, are you still a mother in the future? Because when you are a wife or a husband and dies, you become a widow and a widower. Child dies, what am I? Am I single now? Am I, what's happening with all these constructs, the social constructs in life? And so that linearity focuses on closure. You have to move on, do the next thing, which is where the disenfranchised grief and the concepts put by Docker came from as well. And I think one of the most popular examples from nowadays is miscarriage, for instance. And Corey, our colleague, very generously shared a bit of her own work yesterday that touched on it as well. And we don't recognize a lot of these things. What is one called at that stage? Yes. And I think that's underpinned by that concept of closure, and we focus on that quite a lot. And of course, it misses the point. The linearity of thanatology sometimes misses the point of the diversity of cultures and the plurality of it. Because the way that linear thanatologies would approach cultural diversity, for instance, would be that we would go to a train about Islam, and they will tell us how Muslims do ABC. Well, that's millions of people and communities.
1.2 billions.
So, there's plurality in all of that. So the linear approach has that tendency for generalizability. So we generalize things. It's like saying I was in a social scenario in London and somebody kept talking about Polish people, so from Poland, and kept saying something about their driving. Oh, all these Polish people drive like this. The Polish, it's like, who are all these Polish people that you're talking about? Do we know them? It's that generalizability, which is a very common thing in the linearity of life in the Western world.
No, questo approccio lineare è spesso anche appiattente, cioè noi facciamo il training su come i musulmani gestiscono il lutto, però i musulmani sono 1,2 miliardi, cioè c'è una pluralità nelle persone, ogni realtà è singola, però c'è sempre questo approccio molto appiattente, cioè questa comunità fa così e noi l'approcciamo così.
So there are things that we need to be asking ourselves. So first of all, how does a linear model to death and grief shape the expectations the world has of us? So I come from a very strong culture in Greece, like quite a remote part of Greece that at the time as well, it was much more peculiar about how you need to process death in the community. So, the black attire, cover all the mirrors, there's no music, no TV for 40 days. There's not, there's a lot of pressure. Women are not allowed to remarry for an extended period of time. Years. Well, I mean, nowadays it's a bit different. It's just take the blame and be out. But at the time, I don't know if it was 2 years, but I think it would be really frowned upon if within 5 years you had another life. It's frowned upon, how dare you don't go there to wash your husband's, your latest husband's grave. If you're a husband and you bury your wife, you don't have to. That's so how does it shape the grief expectations, and what alternative models can we think of when it comes to the cross-cultural aspects? And so there are the cyclical models of death as well. And I think rightfully so, as Giorgio said earlier, there was a time that even in Italy, you'd have more cyclical approaches to death. There was a time when in Greece, there was more of that. There was a time when in Spain, there was more of that. But, the evolution of societies is not really evolving. But thinking about the cyclical models that really are underpinned more by that conception of as a transformation. And those steps that in the linear thanatology we see as birth, life, death, here we see life, death, and rebirth, right? So death is simply the doorway and the segue to the rebirth, to the continuity and the transformation of the person, of their soul, their thinking, of what it is that they contribute to society. And so continuity then becomes a degree, it becomes a consciousness in those cyclical how deaths understood. And I think the more we appreciate that, the more perhaps we might be able to better collaborate between the two models and actually have a learning curve for everybody involved. And this is something that could apply very easily to financial aid, for instance. How many years the MFI, sort of like the financial agency in the US and across Europe have been the saviors for African nations. If you leave a nation alone in Africa, if you leave Congo alone, or if you leave Zambia alone, they will come out of debt within a year. If you leave Japan, it will be in debt for another 150 years. That linearity benefits something as well. And we can see it in different concepts rather than just death. And there's some core concepts in the cyclical models. One is that of transformation that I've mentioned. You've got the rebirth and the reincarnation as well. You've got the ancestral continuity, which we see a lot in burial rituals and traditions in many societies, and the indigenous populations, which is one of the reasons there's so much tension with legislative changes when suddenly a big building needs to be built somewhere, and that means you dig out bones from ancestors. That means that there's a disruption of the whole cycle of transformation on those beliefs. There's samsara cycle as well, again, that rebirth and the reincarnation that comes with it, and the going birth, death. And then the ecology, which I think a little bit more and more kind of lately in the linear thanatology aspect, we start talking more about that, eco-grief as well, kind of looking at the non-human death and loss and how that then affects humanity as well. So there's core concepts in that, and many of those have been discussed traditions, but also some particular theories in older texts, which I wish we would learn more about in these parts of the world, but maybe we're not. And as soon as Georgia is ready.
I was thinking that the symbol of the conference is a wheel. This is in Turin.
Mm.
And the idea of the secret, it was present in the Western world before in some way. This idea of.
Well, can I just make a comment on because I also use that phraseology because we're here, the Western world. It's the Western world from where we stand. If I'm in South Africa, the Western world could also be in South Africa. So I know that because that's how we talk about, we say the Middle East. Well, Middle East by comparison to what? Those are very colonial ways of us talking and the way we use them. So you find these concepts like in different traditions, like in the Hindu perspectives, where there's that conception of the transition of Atman, and you have the cycles of samsara, which is that rebirth again, the idea of karma and how that starts shaping the rebirth, and of course it affects very much how people grieve. It affects very much how people die as well. Shame and the many people might be experiencing towards the end of their lives because they may not believe that karma has been fulfilled for them to be influenced positively, coming through to rebirth. The moksha, the liberation, the freedom from the different experiences as well, and so on. Similarly, with the Buddhist traditions, looking at samsara again and the reincarnation, the cycle, thinking about death not as something that's the end. It's not annihilation, like going to zero, but it's continuing. There's no 100, there's no top. It's like you start and then you continue and you continue and you continue, and it goes on and on until nirvana. And so there's concepts of nirvana, the concept of stopping suffering. So where there's no more suffering, there's fulfillment. And so the indigenous cosmologies is thinking about, death, and death is just a medium that facilitates the return to the ancestors. Thinking about, so for example, in the US, Native Americans and the traditions and the beliefs, how significant it is within communities to have that as well. And in fact, it's really important. I've seen that in disaster work that I've done. So when I was doing some work in Chile at some point, it was maybe 15 years ago, and it was purely community orientated, but it was about working with people that had survived, but they were actively grieving the loss members in the ruins from the tsunami that had hit. And it's about that belief and that conception coming through, which is about how we will be connected with those before us and the ancestors. How is this going to happen now when that natural event has disrupted that order in their cemeteries? How are we going to be connected now? Which was a much bigger grief they were experiencing than the actual grief as well. Um, and then similarly, other viewpoints like, New Zealand, you've got, the Maori traditions and, that stigma that comes, for instance, in the Maori tradition, there was a colleague talking about tattoos or the day before.
The day before, Susanna.
Yes. The Maori indigenous population with the grief is painted on your face. So for women, women actually have a tattooed a beard on their face, and that's the grief. And it's a hugely historic, very deeply rooted to ancestors as well, tradition and a belief. And it sees so much stigma because the linear thanatology that tries to understand grief for that population does not agree with. So it's just an example. Just a few more things I want to go through with you. So the first one is just to mention Iliadi's work, and I don't know how many of you.
No, he's very famous in Italy.
Okay, perfect. So you know all about it. Perfect.
I hope so, but it's very famous, Jeremy. It's all translated in Italian. It was
excellent. Okay, fantastic. But the myth of the eternal return of that in fact inform that cyclicality and the cyclical thanatology. Talk about that cycle of life and death and rebirth. They talk about the transformation and then the coming back as well. So that's one that's very important. And if it's so popular, let's move on to the mythology and the monomyth. And I don't know again how familiar.
Oh,
yeah. Oh, that's fantastic. That's the But you know, the amazing kind of conception of the hero's journey, that you know every person is a hero in their own story, and going through the different steps and moving from the known world to the unknown, to take that journey where you start being transformed and you learn something and you explore something, and then you come back to the known world being a new person with new skills, with new feelings, with new knowledge. And that is that conception of reincarnation as well. But in fact, I do love the monomyth by Campbell very much. And I really wish it would be used a lot more as a theory and a concept when it comes to grief, when it comes to death, because it really speaks to that. Anyways, if I started like, this is a monomyth for us. We came here at the NIMO conference, came to the unknown. We go back to the known with a little bit more than what we had before. And then Bergson's work as well in the next slide. I'm talking about duration and time. So thinking about, so Bergson did not see time as a progress that, you know, from 9 o'clock you go to 10 o'clock and then you go. It wasn't, you know, time in terms of, well, I'm going to live maybe 80 years or 90 years. But he saw time as something that is very, very specific to the person and the experience. So time for one person in terms of getting a degree at the university may be very different than another person getting a degree at the university, because it has to happen in their own pace and for their own benefit. So there's the recognition of the lived experience of time that he was calling duration. And it talks a lot more about that concept of transformation, that it does not have a fixed approach. There isn't a specific stage one, stage two, but for every person and every hero, the journey will be very different. But of course, rituals, rites of passage, about rituals outside of the linear thanatological understanding of rituals. Because in the linear thanatology, a ritual, yes, there's the ritual and it facilitates ABC. But a ritual in the cyclical thanatology can be much more plural in the way that it is used and why it is used. And I think the understanding of the differences between cyclical and linear is important to be able to better understand not only the experience of the person, but also those rituals and how they're used for that person. But there's, of course, many critiques around this as well. I think again, it's a similar critique as the linear thanatology. Like, do we have the tendency to generalize again? Because there's no panacea really. It's not, you know, there's no utopia about it. And how can there be a healthy dialogue between the two and the different traditions? And how can that become beneficial to everybody being affected by that? And as a finishing point, what I wanted to do is just to mention, you know, just to show a couple of examples of what global thanatology and what the models might look like. And one example is Kotwage, which is an ancient traditional ritual in Japan. And I can see a couple of you nodding your heads that you might know the ritual, but it's the collection of the bones of the deceased after they have been cremated. So the remainder bones after cremation that are picked out with special chopsticks. And it's a ritual that the family does, which is a process to help the soul transition over into the next phase. And it's very significant that it starts from the feet and goes up onto the body, because you start from the feet because they will walk across and transition.
What is the important bone here? Only the head of the family can pick this bone.
Yeah, so the head of the community will only pick, yeah. But it's a very unique and important tradition, which is a very good example for cyclical thanatology. Another example is the Tibetan sky burials, which I know they're more known, but I don't know how far the practically how they happen is known, because the way it happens is that this is the way to, yeah. So basically it's like a butcher shop. So you do chop up the body and you make pieces of meat and you offer it high up in the mountain for typically vultures to eat. But it is a hugely historic and important tradition in Tibet, and only particularly trained people or monks can do that. And it's a very specific kind of way of letting go of the body, which is not belonging to people, and actually embracing the chance for reincarnation and rebirth. Do you want to say anything?
Molto velocemente, per esempio in Giappone la famiglia prende, quando venite cremati non diventate tutti un sacco di pezzi di osso che in Europa, in Occidente vengono maciullati per fare polvere, in Giappone vengono raccolti con le bacchette dalla famiglia in maniera molto rituale, oppure in Tibet, il discorso della sepoltura aerea, che magari molti di voi conoscete, ma forse non sapete che comunque c'è gente, i corpi vengono fatti a pezzi da una categoria di lavoratori ben precisa, che fa pezzi corpi e li dà agli avvoltoi. E sotto c'è un ritorno alla natura pure, perché il discorso è si torna alla natura, si torna a far parte di quel grande gruppo che è la natura, che è gli animali.
And I take it everybody would be familiar with Dia de los Muertos. That's another kind of thing of the ofrendas and kind of like the remembrance. And what we say that there's one old death, which is the day when nobody remembers you anymore, right? And that's the actual death. And so for tasks that are created in the shrines, that's the purpose of them. And the last example is that of in Madagascar, the bones, so which every few years you dig out the bones, wrap them in a shroud, and then dance with them and take them around. And it's important so that, I mean, there's a joke in Madagascar about that, you do that so they don't get sores from, how you get bed bound if you lay in one place. But it's an important ritual to support continuous transformation and change and rebirth for the person. And yeah, and I want to close with something and side note. So there's a couple of these things have videos so that you can watch actually the practice. And I want to close with one thing. So essentially, the talk about global thanatology is a respectful consideration, an actual of the diversity and plurality to death and grief, which cannot be taught in a classroom, I don't think, which cannot be written in a textbook. Those could be helpful means to do it, but it is a lived experience. So global thanatology is a lived experience. And I think anyone working in the field of death studies, being interested in the field, or anyone who is in fact a thanatologist, should always maintain connection and linkage with those opportunities that would provide that lived experience. Um, and this has come out of part of the latest work, and I will stop there, that I did with two fantastic colleagues, Hajar Gorbani and Stacy Pizzolidis. And I find that Hajar's input, so this is a colleague, a fantastic PhD student who is based in Canada, but she's from Iran. And the work was done on how to decolonize death studies, and it was happening as the events were progressing in Iran with a lot of outages. And Hajar generosity to take myself through this from that cyclical approach of how death and grief can be experienced, and especially at a distance outside of the limits of the Western world. It was fantastic. And so much of this, many of these reflections also come from many hours of conversations with those two colleagues, and lovely, and he's contributed some of that work as well, actually. So I want to leave you with that. I'm not going to bore you any longer, but I thank you very much for listening, and happy to chat. The question was, so if I've come across psychedelics when it comes to the cyclical approaches to death and grief, and yes, I have. There is a lot more work, of course, and in this part of the world, more and more hospitals and medicine are becoming a little bit more fascinated by the idea, for many reasons, but one of them is because it's cheaper from machines. Um, but yes, and I was sharing this with a colleague actually the other day. I do collaborate with somebody for a number of years now who's primarily based in the Amazonian jungle in Peru and mostly doing work on ayahuasca. And so we do have data from grievers, from grievers from different experiences and how ayahuasca is facilitating that transformation and the process. And it seems to always have a positive effect so far from that data. Yeah. So there's more and more research on that, but I think most of the research would come out in the field of psychiatry quite often when it comes to psychedelics. And I think we just need to be more tuned and kind of keep looking for it because it wouldn't come our way yet.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah, good question. I used to think about time and our perception of time in our society. So I used to studiare più italiano diciamo. Per me un po' il mio punto è il fatto di pensare che sia molto politica la posizione del tempo e ovviamente è la tua parte di
Dazione.
Però mi chiedo, te che le studi e che ci sei proprio dentro, io lo faccio e penso che la politica sia esistenziale, no? E quindi sia un qualcosa che si porta uno dietro mentre cammina, ma dico, te qual è il tuo punto politico? Cioè, come pensi che il tech studies cioè, come si può fare davvero politica in un senso politico, ma politico istituzionale, con un ragionamento sul tempo? Io sono partita
Don't abandon me.
aiutare a stare in un tempo che non è il tempo che ci viene imposto.
I think I understood well the question. I'm trying to convince myself because it's a... But do you want to, can people hear, do you want to repeat
Certo,
question for
la
the
domanda
people?
è il modo in cui viviamo il tempo è una visione anche quella politica, come un po' tutto è politica, perciò Panagiotis, a livello politico, tu come te la vivi? Qual è il tuo punto di vista?
I'm gonna make this very short, actually. And life is political, first of all, and politicized as well. And we are political statements walking around. The clothes we wear, that's a political statement. The way we have our hair, wearing glasses, everything is political in the world we live in. So life is political, and there's realization of life, and there's realization of death as well. And there's different dimensions and influences to do with how death is governed. We talk a lot about, for instance, freedom of choice, but we don't quite understand, I think, what it really means. It doesn't mean that you're free to choose whatever you want. There's no such freedom. There is openness. So, for instance, in end-of-life care, palliative care, there's openness to choose from what options are given to you. But that's it. So I was doing work on transhumanist dying and post-human societies a few years back. So I've done research with, a couple of the couples that have put their children onto cryogenetics and waiting for medicine to advance. So I've had said conversations, and it was all around that conception of the governance of dying and how the politicization of living and dying kind of governs that. So even in end-of-life care and in that piece of work, we're talking about, well, there's freedoms in a hospital and a hospice and I'm dying. If my choice is to be eaten by a grizzly bear, do I have a choice? I don't. So there isn't a freedom in that sense. And that is the politicization, the governance of dying. And I think that's why the linear thanatologies persevere, or they kind of become more impact thanatologies, because the cyclical thanatologies do not fit the mold. They don't fit, you know, the how it needs to be. They can have excess, so we don't accept that. And I remember so I used to live in the US for many years. I did part of my training when I was doing psychotherapy, I did with one of Kubler-Ross's students actually, and the center that the doggy center. Yes, I'm looking at Corey because she knows it. So that's where I did it, and I did energy therapy for young children experiencing grief, and essentially, for those that might not be very familiar, part of it is that you have a room full of cushions and stuff, and kids just keep banging on the wall. So it's like, express all of your anger and everything. And when I was having that experience in the training, I was shadowing some colleagues in the Children's Hospital of LA, and um, there was a circumstance where the family's beliefs and traditions were that the patient would not receive blood transfusion, for instance. I mean, mind you, this
Joe
was
Witness.
yeah.
Oh.
So mind you, this was like what, maybe 20, no, 18 years ago, maybe something. So in this space, there's been a lot of change on that for many places, but it's recent change. So I remember that event, and the hospital was no, and said, no, we're doing what we say. So that's the governance, that's the politicization and what it looks like. So I don't really have an answer, but I think it's a great question, and it's just something that we need to keep exploring. Responsibility, because the more we subject ourselves to those norms, the more we feed into that politicization as well.
I think you're here.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Sì, però l'ultima domanda a tuo tempo. Facciamo una pausa brevissima. No, l'ultima, poi 5 minuti. Ancora. Velocissima.
Lei ha parlato di politica,
Ok,
no?
siamo tutti
La
comunisti
politica
qua.
incide molto sulle pratiche funerarie e può essere devastante quando impone regole che non sono in linea con il momento storico, culturale, sociale. Solo per
Ok.
l'Italia è molto forte. Io spero che i giovani aumentino le loro competenze, perché per fare il politico non bastano più di mano. Che ne pensi?
So just to make sure that I understand, so that the younger people would have a different stance on that.
No, the thing that we hope that younger people are going to be better in politics than what we do. Like they will be more. They know that you just cannot improvise to be a politician. You should know what you're doing, because our criminal laws, it's half of the things that you say that are illegal in Italy.
Yeah. I don't have the answer, but I will say this. I have two answers actually, but none of them will be good.
Sì, tu vai.
I'll say it and he will.
Sì.
So the first comment that I'll make is that I don't know, because I think even the younger people, so the giovani that are attracted to politics, are not necessarily the right young people to do politics. They're probably the offsprings of that ideology that is already there. And so I'm not personally that hopeful of that. That's my observation. And the second comment I'll make is I don't know if it has to do with age. I think it's just that politics is a place that could do better with more women running it, probably. Because if I think historically, there's never been really a war that started by a woman. So I would kind of like be keen to go towards that direction, I think. I think there's something inherently wrong by who the actors have been for a long time. Do you want to say more about it?
Il discorso è che io ho paura che i giovani che si avvicinano alla politica siano quelli che comunque collegati alla vecchia politica
Certo.
e che comunque non sia solo questione di età, ma anche di genere, magari Dio, e di diversa rappresentazione. Ok. 5 minuti di pausa. Tanto è ancora presto. 2 minuti, vi fate un caffettino, una sigaretta veloce.